Transforming Masculinities and Engaging Men. And this is all in the framework of developing some more gender language within the process of drafting a partnership with Abad, Amnesty Netherlands, and Defenders, of course, and PAX. The panel consists of three great speakers. I'm going to have them introduce themselves. So maybe let's start with Dean Peacock. You can shortly tell us where you are right now and what it is that you do.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you. I'm Dean Peacock. I am the director of an initiative called Confronting Militarized Masculinities at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I know you heard from my colleague Jamila last week. I recently joined WILF and I'm delighted to work for the oldest women's peacemaking organization in the world, established in 1915, as I'm sure you heard from Jamila. I've been working on issues related to men, masculinities, men's violence against women, and conflict for a very long time. I was part of the End Conscription campaign in South Africa in high school back in the mid-1980s during the state of emergency there, and then worked with perpetrators of domestic violence for much of a decade, working directly with perpetrators in schools and jails, doing prevention work in San Francisco. And then for the last 20 years, have been back in South Africa. I started an organization called Sonke Gender Justice that does a lot of this work across the continent and globally. I'm a senior fellow at Promundo, and as I say, now at WILF. So delighted to be here, looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, great to have you here from the US. So for you, it's a bit earlier than for most of us, I guess, who are joining in from Europe or the Middle East. In the Middle East, as was briefly already mentioned by Florence, is Anthony Keedi. Anthony, please tell us some more about you.
Well, thank you for having me with you today. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to speak to such wonderful colleagues and to have a good debate around masculinities and engaging men, especially around militarism and peace. My name is Anthony Keedi. I am speaking to you from Beirut, Lebanon. I work for the women's organization Abad, Resource Center for Gender Equality in Lebanon. And I have been working on engaging men and masculinities in Lebanon and the Middle East for around 13 years. Along with the director of Abad, Ms. Ghida Anani. And we've really piloted what it means to engage men and how we engage men from a feminist perspective in the Middle East at that time, because the work really wasn't being done. And through that, I got to meet some of the wonderful people on this panel. And again, so glad to be with you all today.
Really glad to have you, especially from Beirut. We already briefly discussed before this session that luckily you made it well with the recent developments, but yeah, as we said, you might drop out for a couple of minutes every now and then if something happens to the power supply. Thanks. Much closer to where I'm now in Utrecht is Åsa Ekvall. Åsa, can you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, and thank you also for having me. And really looking forward to this. So my name is Åsa Ekvall, and well, that is Swedish if anyone wonders. But I live in Utrecht at the moment in the Netherlands. I have a background, first of all, in working in post-conflict countries and a little bit also in conflict situations for a few years, mainly with women's empowerment and women's rights and gender-based violence, not exclusively, but with a lot of focus on that. I did that for about 10 years. And then I started working on a PhD because I was really curious about the links that I thought I saw between levels of violence against women and oppression against women in societies and the other levels of violence, well, levels of other types of violence, so to say, in the same societies. And it led to a thesis about how patriarchal norms on gender roles, including sexuality, are linked to different types of violence. And yeah, now I work as a consultant, and well, I'm glad to be here.
Really glad to have you. And maybe just a quick note to everybody, please, if you have any questions that come up, as Franz already said, you don't have to be an expert. Even the most basic questions, it helps us if you ask them, because then we can improve our common knowledge of what we're about to discuss. And I think Åsa could really kick us off, give us a good start in understanding what we're talking about today. I read on your website that you, at a certain moment, came to this realization that the bigger gender inequalities were in a society, the more violence you also saw. And I believe that's what sparked you to really dive into these patterns. Could you give us maybe a clue on what we mean by masculinities in the context of peace building, and maybe also how we can differentiate between masculinities and violent masculinities?
Yes, the last one I'm not sure I can answer to, because I don't really differentiate in that way. But well, first of all, I think we have to take one step back and look at how patriarchal norms are informing our ideas about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. For a long time, we have talked about masculinities and femininities instead of talking about women and men, to make it clear that we talk about societal and cultural expectations of what we're supposed to do, and not the biological part. However, it is still men that are performing, I would say, 99.9% of the violence in the world. And while most men are not physically violent, all men are still kind of part of a gender order where they have an advantage in society. Even here in the Netherlands, there are men. It's easier for men to become a politician, to become a CEO, to have good positions in society. Women are to much lesser extent economically independent, and so on. So there is still a system in basically any country in the world where men as a group has an advantage, and they're considered somehow to have more value than women. And that is important to have in the background. So when we talk about norms on masculinities, I prefer to say norms on masculinity than rather masculinities, because it becomes so as it's something that cannot change. It is important then to remember that everyone is part of this system. It's not an individual choice necessarily. So yes, there are some men who choose, for instance, to be violent against women in a way. There are some men who participate in violent crime, terrorist activities, who become soldiers, who etc. But all those men who are not performing this kind of very sort of visible violence are still kind of condoning it if you don't speak out about it, if you don't do anything. And we see the same thing happening structurally with the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, that if you, as a white person, well, if you don't say something, if you don't do something, then you're complicit in the structures that continue the oppression. And it's exactly the same with patriarchal norms and sexism, that as a man, you do profit from the system to different degrees, obviously, because there are also it's intersectional. It also depends on your class, your ethnicity, religion, whatever. there are many, many intersectional identities, and they are all sort of put on a hierarchical ladder where some men are seen to be a bit more worth than others, and other men feel a need to prove that they are men, and a way to do that is to use violence. So I would say that there's not really a nice masculinity and a not nice masculinity and so on. There's a spectrum of everything, and as I think Dean is going to talk about also, that what we would really like is, of course, a world where it doesn't matter what your genitalia looks like, that you're fully free to be who you are, and that you don't need to prove yourself all the time, that you don't need to prove your masculinity, to prove that you're a real man by hitting someone who you think insulted you, or so on and so forth. And when it, yeah, okay, maybe I should stop there for the time being.
Thanks. I think that's a very interesting notion on how this whole group of norms on masculinities shape this pattern, that even if you're not violent, if you belong to a certain group or gender, you profit from. Maybe you can say a bit more on how it functions in the context of peace building, maybe, or how it relates to this topic of peace and conflict.
Well, peace building or conflict prevention. So if you want to have a peaceful society where people actually are fine with living together, so we're talking positive peace, not just absence of conflict, then I'm wondering, how can anyone think that a society that is based on structural injustices can ever be a peaceful society? If when you have a system where you have internalized that some categories of people are less worth than others, and we start with women, half of the world's population, but also others, so men who don't conform to the norms of masculinity, homosexuals, but also men who are of a different ethnicity, with a different skin color or different religion. So you have internalized that there are categories of people, and these categories of people have different value. Well, then it's also much easier to use violence, because it's much harder to use violence against someone you think is your equal than someone that you think has less worth than yourself. And we have also seen that in basically any armed conflict, how the propaganda is used to dehumanize the other, that the enemy is basically, they're basically animals, so you can kill them because they're animals, they're not humans, and so on, so they're less worth. So by working on that everyone has the equal value, you do directly work for a peaceful society.
That's a great thought, and that brings us also back to the notion you found earlier, that the more equal society, that's the other way around, maybe the more peaceful then.
And we do know that. I mean, for instance, what I found when I did my PhD research was that in countries where people think that gender equality is a good thing, there are much less forms of violence in society, from criminal violence to internal conflict. And that goes also for where that people think that it's okay with homosexuality, that's acceptable. In countries where people think that gender equality is not a good thing, where homosexuality is unacceptable, there are much, much higher levels of all types of violence in society.
Easier to be violent against someone we think is worth less. And that's something to really think about. Thanks. Maybe let's move to Dean, working for WILP, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, a feminist organization that we also have a long history of working together with. Why does WILP work on masculinities, and what's the link between these masculinities and militarization? I think you can really tell us about that.
Sure, thank you, Hugo. And those are big questions. I'll try and keep it brief, but please feel free to flag me if I'm going on for too long. So, you know, quite evidently, masculinities and men are central to the work of WILP, paradoxical as it may initially sound, right? So if you think about the origins of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, established right at the beginning of the First World War, a war, you know, in which men enacted, you know, really the sort of most crazy forms of masculinity, stuck in trenches, bombing each other, men who, you know, were in some ways emblematic of this very kind of rigid, boxed-in notion of manhood. And, you know, WILP has been attempting to engage men in all sorts of ways over the last 105 years. Not always directly by transforming masculinities, but by addressing the war economy, by addressing some of the structural drivers of conflict and militarism. And then really over the last 10 years, as WILP began to have closer conversations with the Men Engage Alliance, I think WILP has recognized the importance of engaging men directly and attempting to transform and, you know, challenge harmful forms of masculinity. So we've got an initial project now for the next few years, which we'll be piloting in 4 conflict and post-conflict countries: Afghanistan, Colombia, Cameroon, and the DRC. And we'll be testing out a range of different strategies, working together with the Men Engage Alliance. And, you know, part of what I am really excited about, and as I said earlier, I'm brand new to WILP. Today is the beginning of my 3rd month at WILP, is that WILP really takes seriously both gender and political economy, right? So it situates its work on men, militarism, and masculinities within a broader political economy. And a lot of the work that I think attempts to engage men in conflict and post-conflict settings, and really even men in, you know, settings that we might think of as kind of, you know, non-conflict settings, places like South Africa, where I've done a lot of work. The work focuses very much on the men who we can most easily reach. So it tends to be men in marginalized communities, poor men. And that work is really, really important to educate and engage and mobilize men in working class and poor communities to speak out against violence, to organize actively against violence. But I think what WILP is trying to do is to in some ways lift our gaze a little bit and to say, okay, well, what are some of the social and structural forces driving militarism, and how does that intersect with masculinity? So for instance, the arms industry. How does the arms industry produce and reinforce particular ideas of what it means to be a man? And if we look on the streets here in the US at the moment, in Portland and Kenosha and other places where there's been a standoff by, you know, between Trump supporters and right-wing white supremacist, often groups, mostly all men on the streets, as you'll have seen, and then anti-fascist groups and progressive groups, BLM groups, you can see the influence of the arms industry on notions of masculinities, right? This idea that as a real man, I will use a gun as a particular marker of masculinity to defend my honor, to defend my community. So there's this very securitized notion of masculinities, that being a man means being a protector, and being a protector means being willing to use a weapon, and to not in any way backing down. And those ideas, you know, which I think are particularly pronounced in this country where there are more guns than there are individuals, those don't come from nowhere. So if you look at the National Rifle Association and its very deliberate public relations and marketing and advertising campaigns over the years, their use of their magazine Rifleman, it's really to produce a particular idea about what a real man is. Now, I spent the last 10 weeks up in the woods in northeastern California, and the vast majority of the men that I encountered there were wearing National Rifle Association shirts and Trump caps. And I kid you not, I mean, that's a stereotype, but it was in fact true. And so you see these very particular ideas of masculinities that are shaped very quickly, right? So the kind of what the National Rifle Association and what Trump has done in the last 3 or 4 years is to rapidly accelerate these militarized ideas of masculinities. And we see it playing itself out on the streets of the US in very dangerous ways. And I think there's lots of apprehension about what will happen in this country if Trump refuses to leave office, if he is, as we hope, defeated resoundingly in November. So that's the arms industry. If we think about other parts of the kind of war economy, if we think of other structural drivers of militarized masculinities, if we think about the extractive industries across the global south, and if we think about the DRC as one example of that, what happens when artisanal mining occurs? Well, very often the kind of middle people, the larger companies, establish paramilitary groups to defend their mines, to defend their economic interests there, and that then metastasizes, right, into other broader forms of militarization. Same thing with corruption. In South Africa, elite capture of the state, by corporate interests usually, has meant that there's tremendous conflict over who has access to power and state resources at the local level. In KwaZulu-Natal, just one province, as of 3 years ago, there were 500 local politicians, over 500, who had been assassinated in an increasingly militarized and masculinized conflict over state resources. And so what I think is really important about the work Wolf is doing is that it's both grounded in local communities, attempting to shift and engage ordinary men, but it's also saying notions of masculinities are produced, reinforced, accelerated by these broader structural forces, and we have to pay attention to both. So social norms at the local level and the powerful forces that shape those social norms. So let me stop there. But I think, well, just one more thing. Åsa talked a lot about kind of gendered norms, right? Norms of masculinities. And if we think about those are a setup for conflict in relationships, and they're a setup for conflict more broadly. So if being a man means being tough, means not showing fear, means being unwilling to compromise, means aggression, dominance over women and other groups, it doesn't take much to understand how that then links directly to conflict in all its forms. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a bit of a grim picture, of course, and it's very worrisome to see indeed what's happening in the US with this dominant culture of men having to protect, using violence, wearing NRA shirts, waving guns, and also the other examples you gave of DRC or South Africa. And this is such a big narrative maybe, and a big norm. Yeah, it's a norm that's that you see all over the world. At what level can you counter it as NGOs or civil society or as WILP? Where do you start?
I mean, I think, we start by being ambitious. And I think one of the struggles is, of course, it is big and it is daunting to say, okay, well, not only do we have to change the attitudes of kind of men at the community level, but we also have to effect change in these broader systems of power. We know some of what works to change attitudes at a community level. We run workshops, we do community media campaigns, mass media campaigns, and those are really essential. I've spent a lot of the last 30 years working on precisely those sorts of methodologies. But I do think there's a way in which we engage, and Anthony used the term neocolonial earlier. We engage in a kind of neocolonial practice when we don't say, well, hang on a second, what are the systems producing particular forms of masculinities and particular kinds of men's violence? And I think when we ask ourselves that question, we have to, grapple with these bigger forces. And that means different kinds of partnerships. So, part of what I love about the work that WILP is doing is WILP is working on disarmament. WILP is using the whole human rights architecture that exists at the UN, regional levels, national level, to demand that governments take action. And so I do think our work has to be ambitious. I think when we focus just on the kind of stereotypical member of a militia, we're engaging in a kind of neo-colonial development work that blames kind of men on the ground, usually men of color in the global south, for problems that, yes, they are part of, but that also emanate from elsewhere. And I think we have a responsibility to look at the big picture and to figure out who we work with to address that bigger picture. And, you know, I'll give you one concrete example. In South Africa, we were part of this What Works initiative to test different methodologies for ending men's violence against women. And we implemented a big multi-year project in a place called Diepsloot. Now, the men in Diepsloot reported, you know, outrageously high levels of violence against women. 54% of the men said that they had either raped or physically assaulted a woman in the last 12 months. And it's, you know, off the charts. But when we looked at the structural forces affecting their lives, you couldn't walk more than a few hundred meters without coming across an informal liquor outlet, a shebeen, a tavern. People were facing chronic hunger. I think it was something like 80% of the men reported various different forms of PTSD, high levels of child abuse. Where was that coming from? That's not something inherently problematic about, you know, Black South African culture. That was something inherently problematic about the circumstances of those people's lives, created by apartheid, created by an alcohol industry that is predatory in the way that it works. No one's working to hold the alcohol industry accountable in South Africa. And, you know, I've followed the alcohol industry. I mean, their tactics are to undermine government's efforts to limit the harm caused by alcohol. Now, that's not to blame men's violence against women on alcohol, but it's to say those other factors, hunger, chronic trauma, the widespread availability of alcohol in a place where there's not much else to do besides drink, must also be attended to. The fact that there's no work are things we must look at as we look at transforming masculinities, to demand that those men treat each other and women and children with respect is a tall order under those circumstances. And I think if we just stop and ask ourselves, if we lived under those circumstances, how would we behave? And so I do think our work must be social. It must focus on kind of ordinary men and women at the community level, but it must also be structural. We have, I think, that responsibility to do work that looks at the structural drivers of men's violence. Again, you know, without excusing men, without saying they're not responsible for the choices that they make, but to place those in context.
Thanks. And yeah, this maybe to link this complexity, I want to go to Anthony. I read an article where you described your work as attempting to unravel a string of lies that people have been told for centuries, and that sounds like a huge task. And it also links to what Dean just has been describing. This combined patterns that all lead up to this behavior. Why did Abad ever decide to work on masculinities and engaging men, and what's the approach you use as Abad?
All right. Well, I mean, it's quite a daunting task speaking after Dean and Asya. You, Åsa, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. Such incredible points, such a wonderful platform to like start the conversation. So thank you both. Wonderful points. The Abad, in our positionality kind of in Lebanon and in the Middle East and in the global South, we're in a region that has been crippled by constant war and conflict throughout the entire region, whether those wars were created for natural resources, for regional dominance by other superpowers, or whether you just look at the localized reasons for it, which can be sectarian identity conflict, et cetera, et cetera. It has crippled the society from moving forward with the rest of the world and developing and allowing each person access to their natural human rights, and specifically women. like we know in every society, it's war and conflict are disproportionately difficult and affect women over men. And so my background is in, well, now I'm completing a master's in gender studies, but my background originally is in psychology, and specifically I was more into social psychology. And when you stop and think about the generations upon generations where this has been the model, and that this has become so normalized that no one really asks questions, and that's how gender works. No one really, you're told that you shouldn't act in a certain way because that's not how you're supposed to act. And continually doing that performance, again, to borrow from Judith Butler and other notable feminist scholars, if you keep on doing that same act, it becomes normalized within your system. It becomes who you become. It's how you formulate your sense of self. When those behaviors are punished, you would choose not to do them. And when they're reinforced, you choose to do them more. And so we take a look at Lebanon, has engaged in civil war for decades. And now the political leaders, and I say now because so much is changing currently in Lebanon, but the political leaders are the militia leaders from the civil war. They're the people who have utilized power and power over strategies and violence against others in order to garner power. People who affiliate themselves with them, especially men, are the ones who have economically benefited and succeeded in the society. And then you grow up in this society, and not only does it become normalized, but it becomes the pathway to success, that one would act violently or see how they can use their power over other people, keeping women, utilizing women where you need them. Right now, Lebanese society has a lot of women in the workforce, not at all in the same positions of men, not making nearly enough money. And it's all on the back of, when we talk about intersectionality, migrant domestic workers that come over from Africa who are blatantly denied their human rights and who are paid even less than the Lebanese people in order to stay in household and take care of the domestic chores. So it's always at the expense of women. And even when women make progress, it's another woman of, as Åsa said, of perceived lesser value from a racist perspective, who is taking on the grunt of that domestic work that we're economically exploiting. So all of this, when you think about young men growing up and deciding what kind of young men they want to be, seeing flags with guns on them, seeing men in power who have gotten to power through violence, how we always have a militarized masculine discourse that glorifies war and glorifies the accomplishments of men who have used violence and who have led armies. We just see the generational transmission of these same patriarchal gender norms, these same militarized masculinities. And it's cyclical and it doesn't stop. I was no different. I wasn't born and I believed in peace. I was raised, and eventually, even at some point, I did aspire to be a soldier and to fight in war because I bought into it, because it's in the media and it's in everywhere you look as young men. Again, I always say this when trying to explain the link between militarized masculinities and engaging men and boys. I wanted to be a Ninja Turtle. Because they fought for justice and what was right through violence. And I learned at a very young age, violence does not mean that you're bad or that it's evil. Violence is very often the pathway to doing what's right and good. And that's the lie. That's one of the lies in this intricate tapestry of lies. That young men grow up thinking that, young women grow up suffering from that, and very often become consumers of the same patriarchal discourse. And raise sons to want to do that. When there is a war, this recently just happened with the explosion in Beirut, but the use of words martyrs versus victims really plays a big psychological impact when we talk about the psycholinguistics of all of these things, that there's even glory in death, that you defended the nation and you're living up to these masculine ideals. And it's just from the perspective of activists like myself, or my director, Ms. Rida Anani, or the wonderful people that work in Abad, it needs to stop somewhere. And women have been fighting and leading this for years, talking about peace, talking against this conflict-oriented solution to our problems in the Middle East and in Lebanon. And it's about time men started taking up that cause with women, side by side, of course, not at all thinking that now we're here and we'll talk about it. But if anything, going on that personal to political, we can start sharing our experiences of how we bought into this. Men can start sharing experiences of how they too believed in that lie and how it negatively affected their lives, and start putting pressure on men in power, men who do benefit from that, and going beyond the local, again, and going beyond the regional, and talking about, we all know how it was global politics that created so much militarism and war and conflict in Vietnam. And very similar aspects play out daily on the global level and in this region. It's what political interests are there, what economical interests are there, and how do we create a discourse that would lead to seeing war as a necessity for peace, as ridiculous as that is, but that has been given for years, in order to reach political ends at the expense of people, and mostly at the expense of women. And so the whole challenge of how we approach it is to try to get all people to understand that gender is a construct, and that rather than thinking about what type of a man you'd like to be or what type of a woman you'd like to be, it's all about what type of a person you would like to be, and how can we be those people in a peaceful way, and how my interactions as a person should depend on me speaking to another person and not the interrelations of men and women, and really trying to speak to that voice inside their head that they knew was wrong the first time they were told the lies, the first time they told you shouldn't cry, but it was normal to cry, or the first time they told someone to be quiet and not to run because it's not elegant and they're supposed to be elegant. That thing, that little voice that they eventually drowned out, it's kind of coming back into that voice and unlearning all of the things that a patriarchal society has taught us in order to see a way forward.
Thanks. I think that unlearning is something that sounds very interesting, and in the future, maybe we shouldn't even learn it in the first place, of course, so that you don't have to unlearn things that are very natural. And I think this gave the three examples we just heard gave a nice overview of what these masculinities are, how they are in culture, even in pop culture, where you think you're doing good, but actually in a bad way, or with NRA promoting guns to such an extent that they are just our main image of what a strong man looks like. And also, as Åsa brought up, how this system benefits even those that don't actively participate with the silence is violence reference you made on how it's important everybody speaks out. I think maybe it's a question to all of you or whoever feels in a position to answer. How can we translate this notion and this pattern that we see, and I think it's recognizable for a lot of people, how can we translate it in actual programming? How can we as PAX, but also other organizations, really use this in our daily work or in setting up new programs that counter this narrative and that really attack this problem? Feel free, raise a hand if you think. Åsa, please go ahead.
I mean, it's a very complicated question, of course, but I would start with making sure that everyone, if we now talk PAX specific, would make sure that everyone within the organization, first of all, is trained and has participated in many discussions around these topics so that everyone understands the same thing when we say things. Because There are always people who still want to understand gender as being meaning women, or thinking that that's something we can deal with later when we have peace, or who refuse to or don't want to, or don't really apprehend the importance. So I would really start with making sure that everyone in the organization, including board members, from top to bottom, so to say, and well, maybe there's no bottom, but also partners, so that everyone has a common understanding. Then I would look at existing programs together with the teams working on those programs and make a gender analysis and see, are we doing something that challenges these patriarchal structures, or are we doing something that maybe even reinforces them without intentionally wanting so, of course? But what are we doing? Can we tweak the existing programs in a way so that they challenge these structures? And that's a good start for starting to think about then making new programs. I think first look at what you're already doing. That's how I would start.
Right, and I think that the part on are we actually reinforcing these narratives is really interesting, and it's because it's something that's so internalized in all of our upbringing and education and the society we live in, that sometimes you don't even see it, of course, or oftentimes I suppose you don't even see it. And maybe you said use the same language and make sure we know what we're talking about, and not just people who are already active, but everybody, also partners. Isn't sometimes the fact that the language really matters also something that holds back people from engaging, because they feel like, I don't know the full language, so I'm not in a position to engage? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that from there are a lot of people who still, for instance, think that feminism is just about angry women, or that gets very offended if you say the word patriarchal, or especially men who get very offended when you talk about masculinities and violence because they feel personally accused. So I think it's important to sit down and talk about what do we actually mean when we say these things. What is so that we develop a common understanding and not just leave it there, so but that people who are resisting actually really gets involved in the conversation, and we have to listen to why they resist, because it's only when you hear their reasoning for resisting that you can also work with how we can change that and come to a common understanding.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think Asha's talking about something really important, and I'm sure most of you have had the experience of trying to talk about gender and men's violence, or masculinities and militarism, and encountering a tremendous defensiveness amongst the men in the room. There's almost always a hand that goes up that asks the question of, well, what about violence perpetrated against men? What about the ways in which men have worse health outcomes generally than women, etc. And so I do think, I think you're absolutely right that the first step is to make sure people have a shared understanding of the concepts and the language. I think in addition to that, and it's time consuming and it needs to be done well, I think for an organization like PAX, it's really important that people go through an experiential process, that people, that staff people have the time, and the organization makes the time available for board members and staff and partners, if possible, to go through a very thorough experiential process. Now, Candera, a group that was established many years ago in Nicaragua that did pioneering work on this, brought together NGO partners for 4 one-week workshops over the course of a year. And they did it in a very careful, sequenced way, where they brought women together with men initially, and then they separated men and women, brought them back together again in various different processes. Not everyone can make that happen, but I think that is the ideal, to really get people to go through an experiential workshop and to reflect, as Anthony was doing, and I think Anthony always does this so well, to kind of talk about our own personal experiences with this. Because I think part of what happens then is men begin to recognize that there are in fact tremendous costs to men of trying to live up to these ridiculous expectations. And that, you know, by extension, there are tremendous benefits to men and to women when men take on this work and challenge and push back against this tapestry of lies, as Anthony put it so eloquently. So I think sometimes we get caught up in this kind of gender equality as a zero-sum proposition that men inherently lose out when there's greater gender equality. And we do a values clarification exercise as a basic part of our work, and we'll ask NGO workers, you know, men stand to lose a lot if in a more gender equitable world. We ask people to then position themselves, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, etc. And often we find that people doing this work think that in fact, well, men do stand to lose a lot in a world where there's greater gender flexibility and greater gender equality. I think that's really worth discussing, because I think in as much as men feel that they're going to lose a lot, there's a lot of defensiveness. And I think part of our job is to say, yeah, there are certain unearned privileges and unearned power that you currently enjoy, but they come at a high cost. And so let's look at them together, the benefits and the very acute costs, and let's have a discussion about those. So I think we can get beyond the defensiveness when we do that. And I think also when we frame this as, you know, work that has ethical value, that men have, you know, an obligation to act in solidarity with women. So we don't just appeal to men's self-interest, but we also appeal to their kind of political convictions. And we found that combination to be very effective.
Yeah, maybe if I can also, I mean, again, it's so easy to speak after us and Dean, so incredible. But I would say we don't need to start because women have already started for centuries. I mean, a century at least. Dean has the privilege of working with Wilf now, who has been doing it for so long, and the model is there. And this is again where I kind of go back to that personal reflection, and the personal is political. I did not know any of these perspectives. I was quite typical in terms of also having negative connotations associated with feminism or not understanding it. And finally, when I was able to listen, and I think that's part of the trick. It's not the only one, it's just getting the foot in the door, but how do we start these conversations so everyone can see how negative patriarchal frameworks and power over systems can negatively affect themselves and everyone. And then that's the start of a conversation. And the same way I was able to learn, the same way all of us were able to learn from great thinkers who came before, it's about facilitating that thinking, because I definitely feel that maybe one reason why I've had my eyes open to this is because of privilege that I have, privilege of a specific education or specific experiences that I've had. What about the people who don't have these experiences? Where do we expect them to just pick up and naturally see outside of the box that they've been placed in their entire lives? So it's about creating those opportunities together, all of us, and being led by those women feminist thinkers that have brought us. We're standing on the shoulders of giants because everything that has come before us have led us to this conversation. And the only thing I would add is we also need to address the fear maybe that exists in talking about a lot of these things. And I'm not talking about fear of a rejection of one of my guy friends will make fun of me, or when I'm talking, someone's going to, those are all there, but especially in areas where there's conflict or where it's post-conflict, although I'm not sure many post-conflict areas have actually gotten over the conflict. It's the fear of a retaliation of someone with power, because there's the most powerful people have the most to lose in a more feminist-oriented horizontal system. that even acts to abolish the classism that exists in our societies. That is a system of support for patriarchy. And so it really is, can we address that? And when we can speak transparently about these things, I really feel we'll make more progress quite quickly. But it needs resources, it needs facilitating that learning, and it needs being very honest and open about, if this is said, then perhaps these people with money, or these people with weapons, or these people with name, source of power here will become upset and will have some form of retaliation. And I think until we start having those conversations, whether those are political leaders or, you know, whoever they may be, militias, whoever they may be, the national government, speaking out against the national government to soldiers also has a negative connotation socially, because we see people, we see soldiers, and we thank them for their service. Whether or not we believe that the particular way that they're serving is right or wrong. So I think we also need to address a couple of these fears that we have about talking about it more openly.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks. And I think that's an important notion, that the people who have gained most from this system that we're trying to change are, of course, most afraid of the system changing because it will affect their positions. But I also thought Dean's remarks were quite hopeful, that if you weigh everything that you have to pay for what you gain, everybody can gain from becoming a more equal society. And I think that's something we should emphasize more when also addressing these topics. Another fear maybe is that by working on masculinities, also attention and funds within the gender framework are again taken away from women. And of course, there's something to say about that. But how do you ever see that fear or that concern when working on masculinities in this field?
I'm happy to speak to that quickly.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think it's a concern we hear a lot, and I think, you know, it's a concern we have to take seriously. I worked a lot on gender and HIV in South Africa over the last 2 decades, and often think about the model that AIDS activism offers us. You know, in the late 90s, there was very, very, very little money available for AIDS treatment, HIV prevention. It just wasn't there. And AIDS activists rejected that model and that paradigm and insisted that money become available. The Global Fund on HIV, TB, and malaria manages billions of dollars each year. There isn't a comparable amount of money available for gender equality work. Although it is worth saying that mostly the funding for gender equality work has steadily expanded over time. We did an analysis when I was co-chair of the Men Engage Alliance to look at the extent to which some of the major donors were funding work with men and boys. We looked at Swedish CEDA and a number of others. And at that point, it was a very small amount. Paul Dover, who was then one of the program officers at CEDA, reported that in fact it was less than 1% of the work that CEDA made available for gender equality work. And the UN Trust Fund on Violence Against Women was about 4% of the funding. So, you know, I think we're dealing with two phenomena. The one is there's not nearly enough money for women's rights work and for gender equality work at all, you know, particularly if we compare it to the budgets made available for militaries and police and prisons. You know, it's an outrage. So there isn't, on the one hand, nearly enough money for gender equality. On the other hand, you know, it's a relatively small piece of the pie that's going to work with men and boys, which should, of course, be advancing gender equality. So these are not antithetical, opposing funding streams. Although I do think it's important to be honest about the fact that there are groups out there that are purporting to do gender transformative work with men and boys that are doing actually patriarchal work. I know that landscape better in South Africa. I have seen, for instance, our National Commission on Gender Equality do things that are really problematic and, you know, kind of just make you think like, wow, this is really weird. But of course, it's not weird. An institution that is in a patriarchal setting assumes that the work with men and boys must be about men protecting women. So the Commission for Gender Equality, a handful of years ago now, to be fair to them, convened a meeting titled Men Taking Charge. Now, that's not our vision for this work. And I would hope that that institution has shifted and learned over the years. So I don't mean to be unfair to them by referencing something that happened over 10 years ago. But there are other organizations, one in South Africa that's funded by the alcohol industry that does really harmful patriarchal work. They get a lot of funding because they serve as a smokescreen for the alcohol industry. And so we must look at this work critically. We must demand high standards. Men Engage has a really nice accountability toolkit. It's available on the website. If you haven't had a look at that, I would really encourage you to. It's a great tool. And I think, you know, the easy marker of an organization doing good work, and conversely, an easy marker of an organization that probably shouldn't be getting the money we're talking about, is one that has no relationship with the women's rights movement. And so at Sonke, we insisted a key organizational principle was that more than 50% of our board of directors must come from women's rights organizations. And, you know, when I left Sonke a year and a bit ago, 70% of the staff were women. The mandate of the organization had expanded so that it was about gender equality and not just about transforming masculinities or engaging men and boys. So, you know, I think we must all work together to demand more resources for gender equality and gender transformative work.
Thanks. So this should make us more ambitious in trying to expand the pool of funds we're looking at, but also make sure that women's rights are also on the forefront of these intentions of whatever work we do on engaging men and transforming.
Can I say one other thing very quickly, which is that our fundraising work must go beyond traditional development fundraising. So if we look at where money is actually going, right, the offshoring of money out of Africa, for instance, far more money disappears out of the continent that goes in bilateral aid. And that's not just government corruption. In South Africa, many of you will be familiar with the Marikana massacre, where miners were shot and killed as they went on strike. The transnational corporation that was mining there said they had no money to pay workers more, to pay them a fair wage. At the same time, they had offshored to Caribbean bank accounts nearly 10 times more than was being asked for by the workers. And so I think we do have to take seriously you know, international financial systems and close some of the tax loopholes. I'm sure you've seen Rutger Bregman's fantastic speech at Davos 2 years ago, where he says, all this talk about development is meaningless unless you use one word, which is taxes. So I think we have to link our work ambitiously to broader, you know, movements and goals. I think too often we get stuck in this very narrow development paradigm, and we have to forge partnerships with others who are looking at some of the broader social and structural issues.
Very valid point, thanks. I think it's time to also have a look at some of the questions that have been asked so far in the chat. And I also got a sign that Anna had a question, if that's correct. So please go ahead.
Hi, I had a bit of a practical question for Dean. As you were talking about how to deal with masculinities and responses of men within an organization, and one of the things I've seen also in discussions between black and white in the Netherlands, but also between men and women, is this tendency of thinking of victimhood as something quite positive. And a reluctance of being part of a guilty majority, which gives a toxic part to the discussion. So what I've seen a couple of times here, also in conversations in PAX, if you talk about disadvantaged position of women or of people of color, the feeling, oh, but I've been discriminated as well, or I am also a victim of A, B, or C. And I was curious if you can say something about how to have those conversations in a meaningful way without diminishing victimhood of persons that are really a victim, but also why is it so difficult for people to say, okay, like I'm white, so it means I'm part of a history where there is some guilt with the group that I'm affiliated with. I'm really struggling to understand this temptation of victimhood and this reluctance of taking responsibility of your group identity and how to tackle that in a meaningful way.
Yeah, thanks. That's a big and difficult question. I'm not sure I've got simple answers, but you know, a few things. And obviously, as a white South African doing work in South Africa, I've had to grapple a lot with, you know, what it means to have grown up with tremendous privilege in a system that did so much harm. And, you know, so that resistance to acknowledging openly the harm that I have been a part of and that's been done in my name is something I'm very familiar with. And in South Africa, you know, there's tremendous defensiveness still amongst white South Africans and an astonishing willingness to blame Black South Africans for, you know, the many problems laid down by apartheid. So I think, I mean, a few thoughts. One, when it comes to particular discussions about gender, I think it's fine to say, yes, the current patriarchal order disadvantages many men as well. And if you look at health outcomes, again, I'll draw on South Africa, men are overrepresented dramatically in AIDS mortality in South Africa. Men die at far higher rates than women do. Men access testing and treatment much less than women. Some of that's about health systems, and it's about patriarchal ideas embedded in the ways in which health systems are constructed, right? That health systems are for women because women need healthcare, whereas men must be tough. And so it's helpful to even say that this is not just about the failure of individual men to access health systems. It's the failure of the entire structure of healthcare to think more thoughtfully and in more nuanced ways about men's health needs, right? So it is helpful to look at the fact that men commit suicide at far higher rates than women do. Men are, in fact, the victims of men's violence at much, much, much higher rates than women are in South Africa. Men kill men at 7 times the rate that men kill women in South Africa. In some communities, much more than that, 40 times higher in Khayelitsha and younger places where there are very high levels of violence. And of course, far too many men can relate to the experience of being terrified of their father coming home or their father figure. When I worked with perpetrators of violence in San Francisco for many years, you know, the number of men who said the experience of adult manhood was terrifying. I would literally hide when I heard my father coming down, you know, the hallway because I knew what was to follow. And so we can connect with men's very negative experiences of patriarchal norms, patriarchal violence. And that's what we do. When we start our workshops in South Africa, we start with an exercise where we ask men in the room to identify people who have been role models for them. We say, not Nelson Mandela, not Desmond Tutu, someone in your own life. And you can see the sadness begin to show up on men's faces as they say, well, my mother was a role model, but I didn't have a man in my life who I can consider a role model. There was too much drinking, there was too much violence, there was too much absence. And then you can say, okay, well, what kind of person do you want to be? You know, we can de-link that a little bit from manhood, right? What kind of person, what kind of human being do you want to be? And that does get around the defensiveness. We do an exercise where we ask men and women in a room together, what do you do on a daily basis to protect yourself from the threat of sexual violence? And men will, there's nothing for them to add to the sheet, right? Whereas women will go on page after page after page, and you can anticipate the defensiveness from the men. I remember at a workshop at university in Cape Town, a young man saying, what are you saying about men, that we're animals? And the facilitator very deftly said, we're not saying anything about you as an individual. We're saying something about women's experience of the daily threat of sexual violence. And by the end of that, the men in the room were horrified and to some degree ashamed that they'd never understood this reality before. And we could do something with that shame and that horror, right? And say, well, what are we going to do together to address that? So I think there are ways around it, but of course, part of what we have to do with people, you know, and certainly part of my experience was to sit with that guilt and that shame, and to become comfortable with what felt so anguishing about that. And so, you know, I do think that this is part of the affective work when we're doing community education work that we have to do. Lastly, I think, you know, this issue that I just raised a moment ago about helping people to develop some kind of strategy, I think part of what helps people move through the defensiveness is to say, we can do something together on this, that you are not the problem, or maybe you are the problem, but you can also be part of the solution. And I think that shift in orientation is really, really critical. It gives people a sense of, okay, and in fact, the shame can fuel the action, right? So I hope that's helpful. There, you know, I'm sure everyone participating would have other thoughts on this, and I wish we had time to get to those. So,
yeah, maybe may I just say a few more things that was great. Thank you, Dean. And just building off of that, I think Dean makes a wonderful point that a patriarchal system has a lot of victims. That there are a lot of people that are negatively affected by this system, that it's only a few at the top that really truly benefit from that system. And that's part of what we can use while we're talking to people about them seeing the light. They kind of look at it as a zero-sum game that, well, they can't be victims if I'm the victim. No, everyone is a victim in different ways, women disproportionately more than men, and letting them see that that's precisely the reason why we want to move in a different direction. And that's precisely the reason why we believe in something different, and we are attempting to have other people see the truth of something different that doesn't victimize the masses for the benefits of the few. And that's when we can really start talking about the patriarchal system and structures and where those problems lie, again, from their individual place. Also, I still believe, very generally speaking, about the way men are typically socialized, empathy and emotional intelligence is not one of the things that we really raise men for. Again, maybe just in a patriarchal structure or patriarchal masculinities. I think that aids into the militarism because it's very hard to kill someone that you empathize with. So I think all of this builds into this greater, we want the same structure to keep on going. If everyone empathizes with everyone in a poor situation, then no one can blindly take more capital, take more resources without those feelings of guilt. And so we purposely have not made a point of having people empathize. And privilege is a blind spot. And when you're raised in a position of privilege, I've been working in this field for so long, I know that I'll die still learning more things about my privilege. And it's just about getting to a place where you can hear the voices of people who have been marginalized or who don't have as much privilege as you, tell you something about your privilege, and trying to create a culture of hearing that and seeing together what you can do with that. Again, no, most men that I talk to, they get insulted when they're walking down the street and a woman, they'll smile at a woman and she'll turn away, or she'll grab her purse tighter, or she'll speed up her walking. And it's we're very focused on our personal sphere of what did that mean for me, and she doesn't even know me. And you never stop to think how many women are victimized daily by sexual violence, sexual harassment, who know people who have gone through that, and that if we had those same experiences, we might have similar reactions. So it's about working with populations who do have that privilege to try to empathize and see the reality of other people's perspectives.
Thanks. And also, I see also have an addition to this question.
Yeah, yes, to add, because I agree with everything already said. But yes, everyone has, most people have been victim of something in their life. But if we can move away from that and look into, as Anthony says, what other people have experienced. So, And there's a lot of talk of ethics of care and how we can transform from traditional patriarchal masculinities and femininities into being people who actually care for each other, and not care being something that's just for women to do. And care not only as childcare or healthcare, but actually caring about everyone, including international solidarity and etc. So care and empathy, and having that as a core of projects that we do, that is what we want people to develop, or to develop more. Care and empathy for each other, and understanding, as Anthony said, that what other people's experiences are, because how I experience one situation is not how the other person will have experienced the same situation. So yes, care and empathy.
Those are nice words, care and empathy. Cannot repeat those enough, I think. Looking at the time, I think we have about 15 minutes and we have a few more questions. So let's try to really have a good look at those and see where we can help them find an answer. The first one, I think, is Els Rijke. Els, would you like to repeat your question?
Yeah, that's fine. It was actually something that Dean said about, let me look at the question again. So some time ago. Yeah, he mentioned the state capture in South Africa and how that was also related to masculinities. I just didn't understand the connection. So it was more like a question for clarification.
Sure, I'll try and be brief. So in South Africa, local government has become a site of major corruption, right? So huge amounts of money that should be spent on roads and electricity and healthcare get put in individuals' pockets. And what determines that is who's in power in local government. So there are a number of moments that become ripe for conflict. The election of your party slate to who's going to be the candidates for local government appointed by the political party determines who has easy access to those resources. And so what we've seen in, a number of provinces, but particularly KwaZulu-Natal, has been the assassination of local politicians in that process. And then, of course, people who report corruption also being assassinated. Who does that assassination? Well, in South Africa, increasingly, it's the taxi industry and young men working in the taxi industry, rather like in a place like Colombia, get hired to, carry out those hits. And so people then begin to protect themselves. How do they protect themselves? They purchase weapons. And so there has been an increasing militarization, particularly within the ruling party, because that's who's in power and who has access to those state resources. And so you've got a growing culture of young men using weapons to settle political scores. And it then, of course, begins to spill out. So the taxi industry is now associated with the criminal underworld in a whole range of ways, also transporting drugs, weapons, and we have an increasingly then militarized subculture there. And in election times, we've seen that become quite problematic. And so then threats between political parties of, we're going to take your politicians out, which at Sonke we ended up, issuing formal complaints to the Parliamentary Ethics Committee about. And I mention that because that's another strategy that we can use, right? So use the existing accountability architecture to hold men in positions of political power accountable. So I hope that answers your question. I think, you can go further with it and say, okay, well, what is it about masculinities that allows men in a range of different settings to prioritize their own needs over the needs of others, including women and children, not to lump women and children together. And we've seen that. So there's been important research done on how decisions get made in the arms industry, hugely gendered. How do decisions get made in the pharmaceutical industry about who has access to life-saving medication? Also very gendered, right? So the person who pushes back against a profit motive being told, what kind of a man are you, crudely speaking. So it's in both directions, but particularly the ways in which corruption leads to militarization and then militarizes ideas of manhood. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Looks like it does. Thanks. Ilse is up next. Ilse, please go ahead.
Yeah, great. It's a real pleasure to listen and learn over this last hour already. What I'm just trying to think of is a situation we're currently in as an alliance. So between Abad, Amnesty, Defend Defenders and PAX, we're at the outset of a journey of trying to work with masculinities in really complex conflict settings, countries heavily affected currently by armed conflict, but also in which community socialization processes are affected by armed conflicts over decades. So thinking of environments such as Syria, Iraq, Sudan, Colombia. So that was my question arising from what are key learnings from Abad in Lebanon and other countries in the Middle East, and from WILP through your sections, as well as this project on militarized masculinities, to initiate this engagement on masculinities. I'm asking, I think, partially as well because I've got multiple years of experience working on the Sudans, and I can imagine that this is going to be a very careful process to bring this work in.
People are wondering, Anthony just texted us that his electricity cut, so we will see him return maybe quickly, but we can't say yet.
Yeah.
But one of the other two might be able to answer this question.
Åsa, would you like to, or do you want me to jump in with some practical experiences?
I think feel free to start, Dean.
Okay, sure. So I think it's useful, Ilse, to think about a broad spectrum of programming. I think we know best how to do work at the local level. There's a ton of evidence now about what kinds of programs are effective in shifting the attitudes of workshop participants. There's another set, a kind of level out of what's effective at changing community attitudes. Programs like SASA out of Uganda. So we know a lot about what works at the community level. I think, you've heard me say this a number of times. So we must do those, and we must make sure that they get taken to scale in whatever ways are possible. So work with the relevant government ministry to make sure they get embedded in schools or departments of social development or departments of health. And that's no small order. There are very few places where evidence-based interventions have been adopted and taken to some kind of scale. But I think we must insist that that happens. And I think working with government from the outset is really important to make that happen. I think very often we go in as NGOs and we work kind of invisible to government. We demonstrate great practice and then we disappear and it doesn't get adopted. So I think that's an important level. But I do think there's work that we can do to hold men in positions of power accountable. It's very context specific. What you can do in South Africa is obviously really different from what you can do in Sudan or Colombia. In South Africa, Julius Malema, when he was head of the African National Congress Youth League, now head of his own political party, made comments that we at Sonke thought directly contributed to rape culture. So we took him to the Equality Court. We charged him with harassment, discrimination, and hate speech. And the Equality Court, after a year of court proceedings, which were in the news all the time, and meant that there was a conversation happening in South Africa about the roles and responsibilities and accountabilities of political leaders, the Equality Court issued a ruling that forced him to make an apology on national television and to provide money to Battered Women's Shelter, his own money, which he refused to do. So Sonke then took the matter further and we attached his property. And so I do think that that kind of political accountability work is really important. And we did a lot of that in South Africa using the Human Rights Commission, the Equality Court, the Commission for Gender Equality. In Colombia, ACUC, which does amazing work on conscience objection, as you may know, took a case to the Constitutional Court in Colombia, arguing that recruitment practices were unconstitutional. and that they were targeting young men in ways that violated their rights. So those are the kinds of strategies that I think we can think of that move us up a level, right? We can think about the infrastructure that's necessary to provide psychosocial support to young men and young women who've been exposed to trauma. We know the greatest predictor of a man's use of violence in a relationship is his exposure to domestic violence in the home as a child. But we haven't done a lot with that knowledge. We've known that for a long time. But I think that then demands that we say, okay, we must put in place, as best as we can, evidence-based interventions that work to address children's exposure to trauma. They must be available to boys and girls, but we know that if we provide them to boys, we have a good chance of interrupting intergenerational cycles of violence. And so all that to say, I think there's a spectrum from community education to mass media, to educating service providers, to national laws and policies, to accountability mechanisms, and we must engage with all of those. I don't think we can limit our work with men and boys for gender equality to community education. That's important, and I'm a big supporter of it, but I think we must be more ambitious than that. We must look, as I've said a number of times now, at the broader social and structural forces shaping and reinforcing harmful ideas about masculinities. I would like to, before we close, just challenge us to think about how we describe this work, but I'll see if there's time for that, and I'll stop there.
We'll surely come back to that, I promise you. First, Åsa has something to add on this question.
Yeah, I worked as a donor for local women's organizations in the Caucasus for several years, and that's something that really taught me that if you want something to really work, you have to work through the local organizations. It's because they know their context and they know their situation, and basically everywhere, okay, to different extents, but still you can always find at least local women's organizations, and sometimes you're lucky, you even find organizations that are part of the Men Engaged network and so forth, who are working with the men in a pro-feminist way. But you can at least always find women's organizations, women's rights defenders, and so on. Work with them. They know what they need, and they know how they need things, because we know the theory, we know maybe how to get resources, and we maybe know how to support, but we don't know how to best implement things in a country far away from us. They know that, and they know what their immediate priorities are. So even in a discussion on how to start working on masculinities and norms and masculinity within the gender framework, I would start that conversation with the local women's organizations in the country where I would like to do my programming, because I'm sure they would have a lot of ideas and insights to continue to build on.
What we need to do is ask the right questions.
Yeah.
And build from that. I think that's a good notion. Thanks. Okay, so looking at the time, we have one last question that Michelle will ask soon, and then I would like to end after that by giving you the chance to give us one last concept or thing you would like us to take away from this session, including maybe your critique, Dean, on some of the terminology. And then, yeah, maybe it's 2 minutes over time, but I think we'll end. It's interesting nonetheless. So, Michelle, your last question.
Yeah, let me first start by saying how much I'm enjoying this webinar. I'm really thankful to be able to be part of that, and I would encourage all people like all of us to share this within our organization and organizations. So I'm really enjoying this. There's been some examples already, and I would be really interested to know even more examples of where we can find entry points to change those toxic masculinities in those layers of, like, change agents in those layers of power where we actually have leverage over. Also considering the amount of resistance that is going to happen for the risk of these layers of power losing their privilege. So that would be something that I'd be interested in hearing more about, what we can do from our perspective once that we are more convinced of that we need to change this.
Åsa, you want to start?
Wow. You are a very established and recognized organization with a lot of partners, a lot of cred with the government in the Netherlands, with other organizations here and so forth. I would say use that. You work on advocacy here in the Netherlands to start with, because there's a lot of people in this country who do not understand the necessity to work on patriarchal norms and changing gender norms and how that's related to violence. So that can also, as extension, change norms that the policies that the government does when it comes to foreign policy or etc. You have a tremendous potential for advocacy here. So that would be one thing. Yeah, in your programming, of course, it also depends on your ability to get funding, because without funding, no program. But I would say to have a gender component, the gender aspect of wanting to break down patriarchal structures or at least challenging them within every component, when it's looking at combating poverty, when it's looking at working on arms trade from nuclear weapons to small handguns. There's a gender aspect to have on everything. So yes, please incorporate that in every aspect of every program that you do.
It's a challenge we can accept. Now we have to live up to it. Dean?
Great, that's fantastic. And thanks for focusing in on the big picture there. If I sort of then move it in another direction of thinking about, well, what are the entry points in a national context? I've talked about community education, obviously. You probably heard Jamila, my colleague, talk about the work that they've been doing in Afghanistan with imams and with youth. And I was astonished to learn that of the 10,000 volunteers who make up the WILP membership in Afghanistan, about a third of them, about 3,000 are men. And that they have done work with, I think, 6,000 imams and religious leaders. That work can be tremendously important, and those imams have then incorporated gender equality messages into their religious teachings, super important. So in some settings, obviously, religious leaders and religious communities, great place to do this work, appeal to some of the broader ethics in the religious teachings. Those exist, of course, in all of the major traditions. We found that engaging the media is really important, using the media as a platform, so that the ways in which the media report on gender and masculinities and social justice is done with nuance and sophistication. So we spent a lot of time training the media in South Africa, and also using the media to link to some of our more controversial work. When we took on politicians for saying and doing things that we thought directly undermined gender equality, directly reinforced these patriarchal norms, the media were keen to tell those stories. And so I think sometimes in the NGO sector, we play it safe. We found the opposite was helpful in South Africa. Grab the controversial issues and use them to start a national conversation or to continue a national conversation about these things. And certainly every time we took a high-level politician to a court or to one of the accountability mechanisms, we got hundreds of hours of media coverage. And we found that very, very helpful. But I think the media are a really important partner. And, in as much as it's possible, shape the media content. Public service announcements using community radio doesn't just have to be big national media platforms, but really work with community media, train the talk show hosts on how to talk about these issues properly. So we used a full spectrum of strategies, those just a few of them.
Thanks. And that brings us to the end. I think we're a little over time, so we will end with just a short message from your side, maybe to wrap things up. I think it was very inspiring. I think it was thought-provoking, and it also gave us some challenges or some things we can work on. And I hope it really translates into the programs that are now being developed within our organizations. Of course, I really want to thank Anthony, who isn't here anymore, for his great contribution, and I want to say on behalf of him that he also really enjoyed it and thanks us. Maybe as a last kick out, I will give you both the floor, and then we'll wrap up. And also thanks to the gender team for organizing, of course. So maybe in reverse order from how we opened, let's start with Dean and then end with Åsa as a last remark.
Sure, I'll keep it very, very brief. I know we're significantly over time. So, firstly, thank you. It's wonderful to be a part of this conversation. I've learned a lot. I wish you every success with this work. Please feel free to reach out to me and others within the Men Engage Alliance. There's a huge amount of information out there about effective work to engage men and boys for gender justice. And I'd be happy to point you in the right direction, connect you with people doing exciting work in some of the places that you're working, if that would be helpful. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. And, to close, I think, with a sense of optimism. I've been doing this work now for, goodness, nearly 30 years. And, every time I'm in a room talking with men and women about gender, I'm surprised by how eager people are to challenge these claustrophobic, suffocating roles that I think deep down, as Anthony intimated, we all know cause tremendous harm, and that there are many alternatives possible to us. So, for me, the work is not about transforming masculinities, it's about liberating men from masculinities. And I think, if we think about our grandparents, our parents, ourselves, our children, we have been a part of a process of tremendous change, and our job is to accelerate that. So best of luck to you. Please reach out for any assistance we can provide.
Thanks, Dean. I love ending with optimism. So that's a message I wholeheartedly support. Åsa, the floor is yours.
I can only agree. First of all, I am also very grateful for having been invited to be part of this conversation, and I really do hope that I can continue to be part of it. If there's anything I can be of assistance of or discuss with anyone please reach out. I also feel rather optimistic, sometimes not every day, but in a situation like this, when I see that there is willingness to work, there are possibilities, there are so many people out there in the world who are doing such an incredible job, and that fills me with inspiration, even though we do live through times of a lot of backlash, especially in Eastern Europe, but also Middle East and so on, against danger to women, human rights defenders and so on. But I can see that there's also things happening on the good side, and that's really, really good. So thank you so much, everyone. It was really interesting.
Thanks. And let's leave it at that. Have a nice day, everybody. And yes, let's have more of these conversations in the future. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.